So, good morning to everybody. Thank you for joining us again. Welcome. For those that are regular participants in this series, welcome back. For those that are joining for the first time, nice to have you. Thank you very much. So today is a follow-on session from the session that we held on Tuesday. I think if I go to my slides, it might make it a little easier to follow. What was this? So a reminder of what we did on Tuesday is we did it as a presentation session where we covered, where Prabhat spoke to us at a sort of a strategic or high level a vision around CIAM, and then Johan took us through the identity server product from WSO2, and Jonny gave us an insight into Time Bank and the work that we've done there with identity server. So I felt, I don't know how to say this without sort of trying to sound like I'm overselling it, but as objective as I can be, and from a personal point of view, I felt that Tuesday's session had phenomenal content. If you are in the market and you are interested in this domain, whether or not WSO2 is a product you will or won't implement, or have or haven't implemented, the content was of such a nature that there was tremendous benefit. And so it gives you the opportunity to leverage off it for yourself, but B, spread it within the organization. So I'm a little bit behind on getting it up onto the ARC's website. I just had one or two challenges in that space. But what I have done is get some of this video content up onto YouTube. So the presentations and the videos will all end up on our website fairly soon. But two of the videos of the three sessions that we've held so far are already on YouTube. So if you search on YouTube for the ARC Services channel, you'll find ARC Services, and then this homepage is what you'll get to. And if you go to playlists, what you'll see is that we've got two playlists. I mean, this is quite new for us because we haven't really had video content to put up before. So the two playlists that we've got are, we've taken the videos that we took at the Hyatt last year for the summit that we did in May last year. So that's that API-driven World Johannesburg 2019. So if anyone didn't get the opportunity to attend that and they want to pick up on some of those presentations, you're welcome to look at those. And then the two presentations that we've got so far under the, oh, look at that typo, WSW2, my apologies, I'll fix that. That's supposed to be WSO2 and ARC's integration series. That is the deep dive session that we had this time last week with Jonny. That was the follow-up session. And then it's Tuesday's session with Prabhat, Johan, and Jonathan. I'm sure sometime during the course of today, I'll have this recording up on that channel as well. So you'll have access to that video content. And then, like I say, fairly soon, I'll have that plus the actual slide decks on the ARC's website. Okay, so just to calibrate where we are in the journey here. We're now in the sort of the deep dive 23rd of July interactive session around for episode 2 around identity server. Okay, and that's going to be hosted by Jonny. So just last comments from my side before I hand over to Jonathan is, the idea is for these sessions to be interactive. It didn't work out that way last week, Thursday, and I think it might be a combination of quietness from the attendees for whatever reason, as well as Christoni doing an awesome job around doing a demo, a very interactive demo on API Manager. Identity Server doesn't quite lend itself to the same sort of demo. So, that's not available today. We won't be showing you something like that. So I really want to encourage you to take the opportunity to raise a hand so we can open you up for a verbal discussion, interactive. Alternatively, if you just want to post something in the chat or the Q&A, we can pick it up from there. So really do your best to try and put some of your challenges or problems or ideas on the table. It would be awesome to have a more interactive discussion today. Okay, so that's it from me. I'll hand over to you now, Jonny.
Awesome, thanks. I'm just sorting out, of course, my screen here. There we go. So I just first of all want to thank everyone for joining us again. So just looking here at the number of attendees, I can't see all of you, but it looks like a pretty decent turnout. So I just want to thank you guys very much. It looks like you guys weren't completely bored with me on Tuesday. So yeah, as Steve says, this is our time to let our hair down a little bit. We can ignore all the sales guys and we can actually get our hands dirty. So if I do stutter every now and then, or if I get muddy, it's probably me just getting excited. And this is now the session to get dirty, so it's fine. I think Steve and them will accept that. So yeah, during the past few days, some of the attendees they've known me from previous projects we've done or interactions at the summit or something like that, or we even had a beer or two together. So they've sent me a bunch of questions on LinkedIn, and they've sent me a bunch of questions on email. A bunch is overstating it. They've sent a few questions, and yeah. So what I want to do is I want to start by sharing those questions with you guys, start expanding on those. And as we go along, you guys feel free to pop questions. I've got the questions on my other screen, and we'll pick them up as we go. The other thing that I do want to mention, that if you guys want to get into a physical conversation, this is, yeah, your questions are anonymous. So, but if you guys do want to have a physical conversation, just let us know. We'll promote you. We'll switch on your video and voice whatever you want to, and just this is more like a dev stream rather than a presentation. So to start off with, I just wanted to show you guys or remind you on the original slides that I brought up. I think what I want to enforce, or actually, what I actually want to grow upon is the idea and the concepts we had. I showed you guys our portal in the previous session, and I showed you how simple it actually is. And today I want to discuss what's actually behind that portal and some of the things we've done. Also, what Steve mentioned to you guys is we're not going to do a demo. Security is the one thing that I can't show you guys too much of. So I'm going to, I've got some images off the web and some that I've drawn myself, and I've got my iPad here as well that I can share, and we can sketch it out to better answer your questions. But I want to go back to this slide specifically. So what were the first hurdles we faced? And one of my ex-colleagues had a very, very good question. Because when I actually spoke about the mobile device authentication and session management, I mentioned that some customization had to be done. So his question to me was, well, first of all, why actually did we have to do this customization if the product ships with this functionality? And how complex was it to actually implement these customizations? So yeah, I want to just start having that conversation because I think a lot of the organizations that are represented in this chat actually have some of those questions as well. So first of all, the question is why we had to customize. Time had a very specific way that they wanted to actually implement session management from a user point of view. So actually authenticating the device, that's straightforward. The IS comes with so many RESTful interfaces, RESTful and SOAP interfaces where you can actually give it a username and password and start challenging it from there. And, you can start building your whole authentication workflows and all that stuff. So that part is quite well managed. But when we initially had to solve this problem at time, the product wasn't at that point. I think the market really didn't have a specific need, because the IS was at that stage identity and access management focus, not necessarily customer. So that transition has now been made, and a lot of the customizations we did to accommodate this new features or this new functionality actually lives in the new version of the IS. So what we had to do was, first of all, we've got a full WSO2 ecosystem. I think, let me just give you a little bit context there on our architecture. So what we have is a hybrid style architecture. Personally, it's what I believe is it's the best. So we've got a very good service mesh that's built with it's proper microservices service mesh with, well, currently we're moving it into AWS native, but it's built on Spring Boot, and it follows that environment. But not all problems dictate a microservice, and some problems need to be solved very quickly. And for that reason, we've got this hybrid environment where we front the microservices and the ESB with the WSO2 API manager. Even though we are AWS native, AWS's out of the box service that they give with regards to API management just doesn't cut it for us. It's not feature rich like we would want it to. So our customizations basically span two products. The very first thing is the API manager that people are interacting with. They're calling the APIs, they're getting their tokens, all of that stuff there. But when the device actually signs on through this gateway, the IS needs to first of all know who the person is that logs on. Are they allowed to log on? Are they allowed to call these APIs? And once that session starts going stale, it needs to kind of start killing off that sessions. It needs to start, it needs to manage those sessions. Now, those features weren't available in that version of IS, like I mentioned earlier on. So our customizations basically reached as far as a unauthenticated style proxy that would just allow the external or certain external devices to just punch through to the IS. And then in the IS itself, it was to first of all manage multiple user stores. So we've got our internal users and our external users. So it was all about getting these external users to follow a little bit of different stream when it comes to authentication, and then of course session management. So during that time, we had to touch upon some of the authentication modules within the IS, things like that. And because it's open source, and I think that's the cool thing. One thing that I don't think a lot of people know is Time's not a traditional bank in the sense that it's this massive ship you have to turn around. We are extremely, extremely flexible, and it is a dev-centric organization. I can't, to be honest, I can't tell you the last time I interacted with the project manager there. But it's a cool thing because it allows the devs to drive the technology, and that's pretty cool. We think it's cool. So what this allowed us to do was to actually go have a look at the code in the WSO2 GitHub repositories, and from there on extend on certain modules and certain behaviors into the database and to the user stores that other products just wouldn't give us that flexibility. And I think even before we tackled this problem, the WSO2 IS was not necessarily the answer. It was one of the contenders. And because we had that flexibility to make it work the way we want to, and well, WSO2 played game, I must give it to them. Thank you guys very much for that. But you know, it empowered us to actually do what we want to do with the code base. Now out of the box, you've got that functionality. So if anyone's interested in that, that's a whole conversation on its own, because there's some best practices and lessons learned there, because it's not easy. Identity is not easy. Now, no questions, so I'm just going to carry on with the offline questions then. So when I started having this conversation with this ex-colleague, one of the questions he had specifically was with regards to the internal and external user stores. So I can't really I can't really talk too much specifically time related with that, but what I want to discuss is the principle behind it. You know, if we look at the market that it is where it is now, we're seeing some acquisitions, we're seeing some mergers, things like that happening. So most probably, I think some of the audience members, you know, of an organization that's recently purchased some other organization that is in distress. Now, the reason this colleague was asking me this question is because their organization they've got multiple business units. So I thought, no, rather let me translate this example and this, because then it's not customer specific. So I wanted to speak about multiple user stores and their integration. And I think the understanding, I'm not going to go into all the features and things like that, you know, Johan catered for that. So he did a very good job there. But what I want to discuss is the principle of what the IS actually is. It's not your traditional user management product. It is, they like to refer to it as an identity bus. And that's very powerful because it's not necessary that you have to, first of all, get rid of your user stores. You don't have to get rid of your existing databases or LDAPs or Active Directories or ADFS, things like that. You don't have to get rid of that. But what it enables you to do is to think about identity like you would think of a microservice or an ESB service. Is I can chain a bunch of identity events and, you know, or services to give me the desired outcome. So in a scenario where one company actually purchases another one, they're going to face quite a few hurdles. And one of the first hurdles that you're going to see is, well, I've got this whole entire internal workforce that now suddenly needs to start using my internal systems. When company one designed their systems, they had themselves in mind. When company two designed their systems, they had themselves in mind. And to get those two to start merging is such a big challenge that we've actually seen some customers just not tackle that problem and keep them as separate business units under this corporate umbrella. Now, that is cool because that's the easy way out. So it's fine, but it doesn't necessarily bring forth this integration mindset. We've had some of our other retail clients do this, and later on they realized, well, what I'm doing is I'm spending double to develop everything on both camps. So I need to start integrating them. I need to find a centralized way to manage the identities, but I don't necessarily have the time or the capital to go invest and redesign this whole backend and all the systems that interact with it. And that's where the whole concept of an identity bus is pretty cool. So in that situation or scenario that I mentioned, where you've got these two organizations forming or coming together as one, each of them must probably have their own internal user stores, whether that be LDAP, whether that be just databases. We've seen some databases. So what would happen is you would actually put the IS. I actually got a very good image that I want to share with you guys that actually explains that very, very well. So there we go. So I actually poached this image off of a Medium post. So please forgive me for that. But I think it explains very well what I'm trying to convey to you guys. Is you've got two LDAPs carrying different structures, different people, different organizational structures, and you want to start merging them, or you want to expose a single service that would cater for users in their respective data source. You don't want to always mix them up, and you can use that for company A merging with company B. You can use it for internal and external user stores. You can use it even for temporary user stores. You know, the list just goes on. But essentially what the ISN will do is you would register both of these user stores as secondary user stores. So you've got the concept of a primary and a secondary user store. Primary is the user store that the IS actually uses, and that can also be configured to point to anything. But you would set them up as secondary user stores, and using policies and decisions, you would determine based on a domain to go to the left or go to the right. when you set up these user stores, they don't have to be the same structure. They don't have to have the same roles, things like that. This example was actually put on the blog specifically for just-in-time provisioning. So maybe we'll talk about just-in-time a little bit later, but the concept that I actually want to convey here is to say, when you have a scenario where you have to manage multiple user stores, actually, first of all, getting them merged together is a nightmare. So something like the WSO2 IS really helps us there. And to relay that concept back to time is we've got our internal and we've got our external user stores. So what we actually did there is in the IS, we set up our policies to based on domain or certain features, or certain, how can I say, certain criteria within the request it gets. It would redirect to LDAP 1 or LDAP 2. So that was just how we solved that problem. And I think when you start talking about mergers and acquisitions and all that stuff, what a lot of people don't really think about is how do we manage the identity behind it, because it's such a complex problem to solve. And yeah, we just believe that the IS actually solves that problem for us, so might as well embrace that feature. Okay, I'm just going to close that off. We had some, I'm going to open another one here that I just wanted to bring up. So this is this is basically another image that just goes into that storyline. So this is closer to what we've actually done at time. So our users interact with the API gateway. The API gateway forwards the authentication and session management requests over to the IS, and based on a predefined policies and rule sets, and we actually would route the request to a certain data store. Where we saw another benefit in that at one of the other clients, so I'm actually going away from time in this one, is we had a client that, of course, identity was the last one that last question or last tick box that they thought of. And they actually sat in a scenario where they had a mobile device go out, they had a whole authentication stream and everything worked out, but they never thought of, how do I manage the users? And it was the last stretches. So again, we used that feature to give them a temporary user store that was a database, and we plugged it into their how can I say, the corporate workflow. We set up some authentication, things like that for them, and how, authorization and approval process. So based on certain policies, it would redirect them to either the database for the external mobile users, or it would go to the corporate database based on the domain that they sent through during the login. Okay. Hey, no one's dropped off, so I'm glad to see that. Good to see you guys are still interested. Again, just a reminder, if you guys have questions, just pop them. They are anonymous, so yeah, I'll just pick them up from there. Otherwise, I'm just going to carry on. We had some questions with regards to the adaptive authentication. I think a lot of you understand the concept, but some people might not understand the benefit behind it. So one thing we really working towards at Time Specific is to build an intelligent login workflow. When we say that, I think everyone's used to basically an identity, a username, a password, or something like that, and then some form of challenge, whether it be a password, a username and password. So we said that that's good, but if you remember the last slide, we were actually talking about taking it further to a passwordless environment. And doing a passwordless environment, you need to have other criteria to identify the user. So one thing we're really working towards is to build whether that be using machine learning to build a model around your behavior. So how do you interact with us? Do you, for instance, do you do your banking in the evening, and at the end of the month you do it during your work day? You know, when you should be working, you're thinking about this whole lot of money in your bank account, and that triggers, of course, I need to pay my bills, or I need to buy something on one day only. But what that actually does is, as you are spending, these behaviors are being accumulated by your banking or financial service provider. Now, what we actually working towards is to build these models that would learn your normal transaction behaviors, or things like use your geolocation, because all that information, and I think the majority of people on this call actually know that happens. But when you interact with an organization, a bunch of properties and additional metadata goes through to their gateway, and a lot of load balancers strip out all of that data, so you can't use it. But we actually keep a lot of that data, so we can do things like localization, we can do things like location-based services, and of course, from an identity point of view, start learning your behavior. So if we know that you start doing your transactions out of Cape Town, and that's traditionally where you do work, if suddenly we find a interaction or a transaction in Egypt or America or something like that, what we actually then do is we send that data through the original raw data, we send it through our models, and that model determines a score. So that score would determine, is this normal behavior or is this abnormal behavior? If it is abnormal behavior, we go and we trigger another classification. How abnormal is this? And then based on that criteria, we've got adaptive authentication workflows set up in the IS to actually challenge the user a little bit more. So where you would just get let's say a thumbprint, you open your mobile app, you put in your username and password, or username in that instance, you scan your thumbprint. If the model determines, well, something's a little fishy here, it would actually go and say, something's fishy, let me call the IS and tell them to please run workflow B or workflow C, depending on the severity. And it would actually now challenge you with maybe a multi-factor authentication where you have to approve it on another device, or it would send an OTP and you have to put in that device. So it's knowing your customer in depth using machine learning, and then having the APIs and the functionality exposed to all the other components in this workflow to provide these additional challenges. So it's something we're really working on now, because we believe that our market is hungry for that advancement. And I think Africa is actually providing a lot of these unique solutions to the world. We had a very interesting conversation with a Kenyan-based company when we were at the WSO2 conference, or WSO2 summit, also called Telkom, not related to our Telkom. And if you just hear the different levels of challenges that they face, you know, you start looking at a problem from different angles. And I think with us adding this adaptive authentication to an extent that we want to, we are solving the African problem. But of course, the model can be moved to any country or any organization. And this is a very specific financial problem, but I think this can actually be transferred into any organization, because in the previous conversation they said it's every organization in today, modern organization, is essentially an IT service provider in some form. Whether you've got a clothing brand that is now exposing APIs or certain functionalities so that web crawlers or deal websites can get information, can purchase via you facilitating some form of transaction. You've got this style of identity management that needs to happen, as well as you've opened yourself up now. And where traditionally a financial institution is used to being targeted Your traditional business they're not used to being targeted from a financial attack vector. They're looking at, okay, maybe somebody's trying to DDoS my website. So having this layer with this level of strict hurdles that you need to jump through is not just specific to the financial sector. I'm just having a read through here, looking at the questions. Okay. So yeah, we do have a question here. So the question is with regards to the two-factor. What do we? Sorry, guys. Okay. So this user basically wants to know, with regards to two-factor, what does WSO2 out of the box integrate with? So I think a good thing to do is I want to bring up a screen, and for you guys who actually have attended one of my workshops or demo would have seen this before. I want to redirect you guys to the screen, and feel free just to go to the screen. You don't need specific user access or anything to get to it, but I want to bring this up for you guys. So because WSO2 is open source, first of all, I think if you want to integrate with another identity provider or a multi-factor authentication provider or a cloud-based user store management system, the first thing is just to look what the market has done. I think it's not necessarily the best thing to try and tackle this problem yourself. I think it's better to look at the community. People have bumped their heads before. So this is what you guys are seeing here is, of course, the extension store. Most of the WSO2 products already have these additional modules pre-built so that you can use them out the box, and they are curated and managed. So that's pretty cool. So if we just go have a look here at the IS, first of all, you've got categories there, but we're not going to go there. Now, if I'm just going to scroll through this pretty quickly. So you can see there's quite a few extensions already written. So that's fantastic news. So when we try to solve this problem, we actually go to the store first. We want to integrate with, for instance, let's say, and this is something that we recently did have a look at for one of our other clients, because they are also very AWS native. We were looking at AWS's Cognito and using Cognito as our identity provider for certain instances. We didn't go with them. We still decided to stick with AD, but we have the IS actually connecting to this AD account. But you could easily go and get a Cognito or hook it up to Cognito to do additional factors, or earlier on we spoke about just-in-time provisioning. So you could even have the scenario where if you want to migrate your user store from, let's say, Microsoft into Cognito, what you could actually do is have your main user store, or as somebody actually provides their username and password, you authenticate against the Microsoft user store, get a bunch of metadata back, enhance that metadata, and then inject it into another user store. So you can almost have your users' daily routine act as a migration strategy. So yeah, that's pretty cool. But this is usually where we go to first see, did somebody do anything with regards to the integration we want? Fido is another one that we actually have a look at, that we want. If you look at Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, we talk about federated identity quite a lot. And what a lot of our clients are doing now, even though they're not to that level mature yet, every organization, whether they be in the financial industry, whether they be even the agricultural industries, is currently busy with this move. Is they want to start exposing these services that they have to external services, third parties. Everyone's becoming an API store. Everyone's becoming a IT service provider in some form. So the way people want to start interacting with their clients is a more intuitive way, a very user customer centric point of view. So they want, for instance, their people or their consumers, the devs, external devs, of course, to sign up to their platform using things like LinkedIn accounts, Google accounts, things like that. So what the IS would actually in that case do, and I had a very good demo, I think we might even share that that video with the forum as well, where we actually demoed this. So what we actually doing in that instance is having a federated identity provider, something like a Google, and having your application use the IS's login page with a whole workflow in the back end that would redirect you to the Google page. Google would do your authentication, send a bunch of data back to the IS. IS then takes all that data, puts it in its local user store. So you are also building your own profile of your users. So I think one of the things we spoke about on Tuesday was progressive profiling. So you could have your original sign-up process, create your user in your data store, and then as the user starts interacting more and more with your environment, you can start challenging them with, let's say, a Gmail login page. And from there, you can get first names, last names, all those additional metadata. Also, I see that we do have Johan on the call as well. I'm not going to put him on the spot, but Johan, if you do want to jump in at any point and add some wisdom, because he has quite a lot of wisdom. If you do want to add, please feel free to just jump in and stop me as we go. So let's quickly go back. User token management and token substitution. This brings me to two questions we had, and I'll deal with the Docker question a little bit later on. That's always a very interesting topic. First of all, user token management. So we utilize the IS as our keeper token, our OAuth token provider. Or we refer to it as ISKM, our Identity Server Key Manager. So we utilize the IS to actually manage all of our OAuth tokens that the customers use and the mobile devices use. At one of the other clients as well, we utilize the IS with the IBM platform. So it doesn't necessarily have to mean because you are using the IS, you have to use the WSO2 API manager, or you have to use the WSO2 ESP. So again, previously I mentioned that the IS actually has got this interface where you've got RESTful and SOAP calls to manage the users and authenticate the users and things like that. So just like that, you've got a full token management user interface, APIs. So we actually leverage those APIs. We set up the API manager to call the IS itself, because it already ties into all of these user stores. And at the other client where we have an IBM API gateway, we just set up the IS as our OAuth provider. And actually that integration was easier than we thought it was going to be. So it's good to see that the industry is following some form of standard. But when it comes to token substitution, earlier on I mentioned to you guys, we've got this hybrid environment where we have microservices, and we've got a traditional integration layer with the ESB. We also have some proprietary systems at the back end, for instance, our core banking system, things like that. And all of those systems first of all, they need to understand additional data of the user. Who's actually calling this? Do they have the rights to call this? What are their, let's say, for instance, their primary bank accounts, email addresses, things like that, because they might, first of all, send custom notifications out, or they have to have their own challenges, security challenges in their infrastructure to allow certain operations to happen. So what we do there is, when a user actually requests the OAuth token, when at the validation time, when the IS validates the OAuth token that it's received, it goes into our user stores and it gets a lot of additional claims. it then pads it generates a JWT token that has got basic user claims, but then it pads all of these custom claims that the backend systems might need. It then takes its TLS certificate and it signs that JWT token, and we actually add it to the header of the message going to the backend. What that allows us to do is, even in the ESB, so what we've done is we've done some Java code to validate those signatures, but it means that at every single layer going to the backend, you can authenticate the signature, you can authenticate, or you can determine the validity of the token, and you can extract all of the data that you need from that token to complete your service. Now, that's beneficial because you don't always have to take this token, call your identity provider, say, okay, well, first of all, can you now please give me the first name? Can you please give me the last name? All of that data just goes with the JWT token. But you could still say, listen, is this thing signed by you? You could still challenge that thing if you are unsure with regards to the signature. But we actually use that as a authentication mechanism within our service mesh. When people start tackling a service mesh, they don't necessarily think about, first of all, encryption, second of all, authentication. It's usually a free fall, and that's not that good of a thing. So with the with using things like okay, I'll answer that question. Good question there. When actually using a very mature language like, let's say, Spring Boot to do your microservices, there's a lot of modules that instinctively deals with encryption authorization. So we actually use that token to hand over to each microservice. The microservice then takes that token, says, okay, cool, it's signed by the IS. I trust the IS. I can use this data and forward it on. So we use that whole mechanism then to transfer this JWT token around. So we got a question here from a attendee that says, is there a difference between the IS and the ISKM? And if one has an API manager running, is there a reason to use one over the other? That's a good question. So yes, there is a difference between the IS and the ISKM, but it's not big. So what the ISKM essentially is, it's the identity server with the key management modules that the API manager has built into it. So it's the IS plus the key management modules. Essentially, it's the same base product. You could use, for instance, you could use the API manager as is to use its token management modules and things like that. But the IS is built to deal with vast amount of token requests. It's solid, so it's built to deal with these high volumes. Now, API manager, of course, is built to do that as well, but it's more API invocation rather than identity management. So one of the things we usually suggest is we usually suggest people to think, well, look at what your production environment is. If you have a single all-in-one API management node in your production environment, I think it's a good time to reconsider your deployment pattern. So we usually go with a fully, I don't want to say fully distributed, but a distributed pattern where you would see the ISKM actually I can bring up that diagram for you guys. So, actually separating the concerns when it comes to here's a good one. Yes, this is what I'm looking for. Okay. So the API manager itself consists of a traffic manager and a key manager and all those things. I think Christine had a whole thing about that the other day. So I'm not going to go into too much detail with regards to the API manager unless people have questions specifically to the APIM. But one of the components down here is the key manager. So when people go to a more production style environment, we usually suggest to extract your key manager. Pure benefit is scaling. So for instance, you could scale you have to scale your gateway, and you have to scale your traffic manager before you actually have to scale your key manager. So there's some rule of thumbs and some best practices when it comes to scaling as well. But actually having the ISKM handle your key management, first of all, you've got the full features of the IS. You've got the full features of the API manager key, the key management logic in there. And from a licensing point of view, there's no difference. I think the first question is, one, look at your deployment pattern in production. In a non-prod environment, it's fine. You can use just this out-of-the-box key management that ships with the API manager. But when you actually go to production, you have to ask yourself, am I using a single install? Am I using a distributed deployment pattern? And if you are using a distributed deployment pattern, the suggestion would be use ISKM, because you, with no additional licensing fee or anything like that, you actually can get the full IS potential. It's also cool because then you have your existing structure. So what usually happens is you've got your security team working in a silo, and you've got your API digital team working in a silo, and you've got your traditional guys, and that doesn't work. Because what happens is one does an innovation. So let's say the API team come up with this cool idea, and they of course didn't think about security because they're just creative and they're going and they're running, and the security team is a bit more logical, and they're like, oh, but how are you going to secure this? How are you going to manage the users? How are you going to deal with how are you going to deal with these additional claims that we want to start padding? And usually at that point, you've got different streams, and one prioritizes it more than the other one. So you've got something in production, and then somebody goes, hey, how are you going to do that? So actually doing this, using the ISKM and having this deployment pattern, it almost future-proofs you to those things. We've got a client now that's got a very interesting problem where they've got a different system. They've got a legacy system in the back end, and that legacy system contains a lot of attributes of a user, but they don't yet have the resources or time to actually migrate those users into their new user store. So the solution we're actually looking there is, and because we had this deployment pattern and because we have the ISKM sitting there, without having to do another whole infrastructure install and upgrade and all those, we could say, well, fine, let's leverage the IS functionality because it's there and it's out of the box. So hopefully, yeah, if you do have another question based on what I said, please feel free to raise your hand, and we can even switch on your audio if you want to have a conversation about it. So my suggestion to you is, yes, if you are running the API manager, consider your deployment pattern in production. And if your deployment pattern sees a more distributed deployment pattern, my suggestion is to use the ISKM. Okay, I can close this now. Okay, so one of the other questions that we had, and we've recently finished a project like that as well, is how does the IS then deal with this Docker deployment environment, and it's a question a lot of organizations are asking. We've used the IS in Docker, so we're running it in Kubernetes with Docker containers. And this question specifically came about because the specific client, they are trying to, of course, you've got management and the C-level reading up some buzzwords and actually pushing that narrative down onto the organization. And then you've got your techies that are looking at it and saying, well, geez, come on, this is not just that easy. So how do I logically tackle this problem? You want to go more container. You want a container-based deployment. You want to go more cloud native. But again, cloud native, you are talking about, cloud native is almost just a fancy word of being cloud locked in. So how do I deal with going cloud native? How do I go about being container based deployments when it comes to identity? Because we all know that something like ADFS is not going to be fun to try and work with containers. It's going to be a nightmare. So what I suggested to them is to have a look at where WSO2 is within their journey. I think WSO2 is very, even though they still have the narrative of saying we are on-prem, we're looking at your on-prem needs, we will keep on looking after you in the future. We are also looking at what's happening in the industry. So Johan mentioned that with regards to how they are transforming their IS and actually having separate components out, similar to what I just showed you guys with the API manager, taking this, I don't want to use the word monolithic, but taking this monolithic product, separating it out and having those separate components be deployable, whether it be in EC2 instances, whether it be Docker containers, things like that. So we have done the IS as is because we externalized our user stores, because we're working with external LDAPs, because we are working with MySQL databases in the back end. What we've actually done is we've taken the IS and we've built it into a container, and that allows us to, well, have an elastic identity provider, which is very, very cool, because one of the big problems that organizations face, especially with us adopting Black Friday, is you've got these spikes in the industry where now suddenly I have to authenticate more people. Now suddenly my APIs need to scale out. And to actually scale in the old days was quite difficult to do horizontal scaling. To do vertical scaling is quite easy. I can just throw a RAM at this thing, restart, and Bob's your uncle. But that's not the problem we're trying to solve. And what the IS actually allows us to do in a container-based deployment is, if we externalize these user stores and things like that, it allows us to spin up more of these IS interfaces or IS instances and actually talk to the same backends and serve these vast amount of people. So we could build, I would really, really encourage everyone in this chat to please, one of my very, very close colleagues is doing a presentation on what we did with regards to our infrastructure at AWS. We have gone, as they are as Time is one of the AWS partners, we were told to please go AWS native as much as possible. So yeah, Gino's going to do a very good presentation on how we actually achieve that, where we've got including the identity service, ISKM. How do we deal with auto scaling? How do we deal with 100% infrastructure as code, with proper approval processes, with things like rolling upgrades? How do we deal with blue-green testing? How do we deal with patching? Because we wanted to go a full automated during the day. We don't care how many users are using our platform. We want to care about this resilience, this functionality, but we need the resilience, of course, from our identity provider. So we actually have the ISKM scale like that as well, using external user stores. Okay, we've got another question here. Okay, so amongst all the IS connectors, is there one that supports the AWS signature for authorization schemes? I know the person who's asking this question. No. As far as my knowledge, I think Johan might be able to give a WSO2 answer on that. But as far as I know, it's not. So just to give the room of context, I think this is when, if you have a WSO2 API manager and you want to start interacting with the AWS gateway to deal with that authentication between the two gateways. No, as far as I know, but it can be, of course, developed. So you could essentially go extend it, the API manager, to deal with that. There's a bunch of Java libraries that actually deal with this, but my suggestion would rather be have a look at the new API manager. Where I'm really excited for is actually being able to expose Lambda functions natively through the API manager. So that's fantastic. So, you know, just bypass that API gateway and use the IS as the API manager as your gateway. But in a financial industry, there is politics and there is compliance and systems are already there. So it is complex. So my suggestion would be, if you can't go with that, then you're going to have to look at either reaching out to WSO2 itself to assist with that coding, or reaching out to WSO2 to the ARCs to help with that customization. But it can be done. Yeah, it can be done. So if there's any follow-up questions with regards to that. That's actually a very good question with regards to AWS, and I would suggest that yeah, please attend Gino's chat. Is in 2 weeks, so we're giving you guys a little bit of break. Yes, there's a good question. Is it possible to set up the IS in a way that authenticates customers using your own database and internal employees using Active Directory? Very good question. This is, in my opinion, one of the coolest features of the IS. And it comes back to the conversation where I mentioned it's an identity bus. So what you would do in that instance, yes, there is. I think the short answer is yes, there is a way to do that. What you would do is you would set up your, there's a quick and easy way to do it. So if you quickly want to do it, you can have your primary user store be a external facing store. So that would be, let's say, a database. And then people would actually sign on and use it just as with the username and password. And then you could, in the IS, actually set up a secondary user store, which is your Active Directory. And you set that up by domain. So you would have, let me bring up another image here for you guys. So I think I like pictures, so I'll bring up this image. So what you would have is, let's say you've got your there you go, Microsoft Windows Server there with Active Directory, and you've got, for your external users, you've got MySQL database. So what would happen is you could set up, either you could set up your MySQL as your primary user store or one of the secondary user stores, and you could set up your Active Directory as another additional user store. So you're not limited with the amounts of secondary user stores you can set up. And then when the user actually interacts with your API, they usually pass through a domain. So it's the same for any corporate out there at the moment. If you actually want to log in, you would do, let's say, docs.co or docs, meaning the domain, / and then I would put in my email, my username. Or what I can do is I can actually use my email as a differentiator. So I can go jlewis@docs.co.za, and within the IS, we build the logic to look at that domain, to extract that domain, and based on that domain, if it is present. So if I, for instance, use jlewis@docs.co.za as my username, I extract the docs.co.za, and that would tell the IS, please go look in the docs Active Directory if this user actually exists. If it's not present, go look in the MySQL environment if it doesn't exist. But you could even go as far as, let's say you've got these 4 and somebody didn't supply a domain. Please go have a look in all of these and go see if this user actually exists. So that is pretty cool. Now, where that becomes, I think, even more cool, in my opinion, is you could do things like claim mapping. Because let's put it, your internal AD is in a lot of organizations is almost, you've got all these forests, and some of them are complete mess. You've got outdated roles, you've got outdated claims, things like that, where your new environment might be, clean and organized, or, so what you can also do in the IS is say, well, if you go get data from my Active Directory and it is within this context, then only show data A, B, C, D and map it to these fields. So if you think about what the ESB would be able to do, you know, I get a message in, I have to translate it to another style message. The IS can do that, but with identity, and that's pretty cool. So you've got a single payload that you are sending back to the API manager, but the data in the backend is completely different. A good one would be let's see, contact information. In your Active Directory, you might have it as primary telephone number. In your MySQL, you might have it as cell phone number. But what you actually want to expose to your systems is user's telephone number, for instance. You could actually do that claim mapping in the IS so that your consumers have got a single schema that they can expect when they actually get the response back. That's actually a very cool question. I don't want to carry on ranting about that, but I think when you look at identity services, you're looking at more than just APIs. You're looking at what other systems in my organization uses this. Is going to use first of all, my corporate identity, which they're going to use my customer identity. A good example might be, you might then have to expose some form of web interface. You want to now, your sales team and your accounting team now has realized your consumers are using so many APIs and they are making a lot of money out of it. So we need to kind of provide our consumers let's say, for instance, a transactional dashboard, or, you know, I want to be able to go get my billing, but I don't want to go use different usernames and passwords and things like that to access this. So what you could then actually do is build another website, use the IS as your single sign-on provider. So what will happen is this website would then delegate authentication over to the IS. You'd log in with the same username and password that you use in the API manager you put there. It would authenticate you to the external user store and then return the desired roles back to this, and then your users can start interacting with their billing interface. That is really cool, because if I can take you back to the time discussion where we were talking about having the same experience through all of our products. You want the same amount of ease. If I want to have the same ease when I log into my device than I have by logging into an ATM or logging into my web console or logging into that. I think even taking that level of convenience through to your developers' life is going to make your consumers so happy. Your business partners, I'm telling you guys out there, there's some very, very interesting stories. And if you see the stuff that we've had to just integrate in the past 2-3 months during this whole COVID thing, you know, we've got some clients that have third-party integrations where there's non-standard identity management being done. Some of them just haven't thought about identity provider, and they follow no schema, things like that. So as soon as you get to a point where you can provide a better out-of-the-box style product to your consumers, not only are they going to be more open to doing new business with you, but that secure line between the two organizations, auditors are going to love that as well, because you already have your answers. Yes, I'm compliant. Yes, I've got my security stuff. Yes, I've got this password management in place. Yes, I've got this forget me functionality. And I think having that in your back pocket and having that level of standardization is important in today's world, especially in organizations that weren't really, like I mentioned earlier, traditionally security focused. Having the functionality to give their third parties, or even resell that service. You know, you could resell your identity service to your consumer, saying, well, guys, you know what, we see that you're having an issue with your identity management, you know, here's our service. Now suddenly you're selling additional products, which is great. I'm glad to see people asking questions and people aren't dropping off the call. Nice. Is there any other questions? Because I do have one or two more questions from Steve. How am I looking for time? Can I still go on?
You can go, Jonny. If you've got, I mean, I haven't seen more questions from the audience, so
Yeah.
I'm not really stressed. I think maybe just if you've got anything else that you want to chat about, that's fine. But to the attendees, to the audience,
Mm,
I think we'll start to think about your final questions
mm.
because we might wrap soon.
Yeah. So just based on the previous question, can you have Active Directory? And you could actually have way more. So you could have your identity service provider. You could have your IS actually have even more logic. So let's say you're working with third parties. Third parties might have a dedicated database because they are, let's say, at a higher trust level than just the public. So you could have in your integration, you could have, let's say, 3 user stores. One would be for the public, where they actually have to earn their trust before they move into this more trusted realm. You could have your AD and LDAPs for your internal guys, and then you could have a database for trusted third-party providers. So in this instance, you're exposing your SOAP, your SCIM, and RESTful services, but you're having all of this logic in the back end. So for instance, if the login comes in, I think even before you get to this point, you even have your custom workflow management. So you could set up things like, I want a sign-up portal. In the sign-up portal, I'm looking at the username, and if the username has got an email address that I trust, which is one of my third parties, I then take you through an approval process that would see, let's say, external party member doing the approval, or an internal project manager actually being able to do the approval for this user to sign on to the API manager. Where if it is a public, someone from the public, what you could do is you could have them redirected to a Google page. And I think that's where progressive profiling, it's one of the concepts not a lot of people understand the importance of. So I'm allowing you to see, let's say, for instance, my APIs by signing in with your Gmail address. From there, we get things like the minimal stuff. We get your username. We might be able to, using just-in-time provisioning, we get your username. We might get an email address, of course, because it's Gmail. And we might get some, whatever other metadata we can get back. We don't necessarily deem that enough for you to see the entire API catalog. So what would then usually happen is, you'd have your sales team being on the point and having monitor that, seeing, oh, but suddenly this guy is using more APIs. Let's reach out to him. Let's learn more. Let's go through a whole KYC process. And as this user starts, as we learn more about this user, for instance, okay, what organization are you part of? Is this billing address that you gave me actually real? Is this credit card information you gave me, is it actually real? This builds the whole identity, progressively builds the identity of the user calling our system. It allows us to trust this person more, and that trust puts him into another domain or another realm where he could see more and he can play more. So yeah, you would even see maybe one of those users turning into a third-party contributor. So it's pretty cool. But at the authentication level, yes. So all those APIs would go in. We'd look at the decision. Is this part of the sales team? Yes, it is. Well, redirect that to Salesforce. Is this, for instance, an external member? Well, redirect them to the Google login page. Or is this a corporate client? Looking at that domain I mentioned earlier on, well, let's authenticate against LDAP, AD, a database, or whatever other, even if you're using something like ADFS, you could even have the identity server redirect you to ADFS. So you'd set them up as a federated identity provider in the back end. So it's not saying, I think the big thing here is the IS doesn't necessarily have to replace everything, but it can definitely be used to normalize and standardize everything. And I think if that's the main theme I can get through to everyone, that is, then I've done my job, is saying I can provide a unified, pretty front end, but I can sometimes have a messy back end. And I think that's the whole idea behind integration, saying, well, all of the mess that my organization has in the back end, outdated software, maybe some proprietary stuff, maybe some messy mapping, somebody didn't follow best practices. I can normalize that in a standard way and expose that product as an interface to my clients.
I think that's quite a good point to sort of close out on, because that's part of that key message. And you put it well. Thanks, Jonny.
Thanks.
Did you want to cover anything more proactively from your side, or is there anything else? I haven't seen any more questions.
No, I think what I want to do though is, I think please feel free to send more questions. I like answering these questions. I like solving problems. So some of the names in the list I do know, some of you I don't. So yeah, feel free to send me any questions. I always like to help.
All right, cool. In that case,
we've got another one. See, I told you guys. I told Steve that I'm a very competitive person. Okay, and the previous session we had, there were basically no questions. So I want to thank you guys very much for putting me in the lead. And I really want to encourage you guys to, in Gino's session, I like Gino, let him win, it's fine. So this question is, we had a scenario whereby a few LDAP entry points have been configured and are visible, blah, 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 blah. Have you had success in just returning the username and not the LDAP configuration? Token issue. Yes. So I think that is the big benefit of having a identity bus. Is essentially what you can do is you can authenticate to your traditional LDAP, and whatever LDAP gives you back, you can now normalize it. So I want to remove A, B, C, D from the usernames before I send it back, or I want to remove all of the additional claims and I only want to send back the username in a certain format. You could even go as far as saying the username that I know internally might be an employee number, but the username that my requesting service wants is of another format. So what you could actually do is query LDAP, get that identity back, and using a combination of different claims, reconstruct a new username and forward that to the backend or to the requesting system. So you really have that power. But I think understanding the IS and its subcomponents becomes very important. I think having a look at where the IS can be extended and what affects where is the big thing. So I think if you, because I see there in the identity XML, never seem to use new libraries. Yes. So I think understanding how the whole WSO2, not just the IS, but all of the WSO2 products, how they tie in and how the libraries interact and how you actually override and introduce your custom modules, that becomes very important. So yes, it can be done. You just need to approach it in the correct way. Okay, is there any other questions? I've got 400% more questions, so I'm happy.
And that was like on the 10 divided by 0 is still 0, Jonny. That was on the gong. So sort of this is last chance. You're going to get my little close, which is really just talking about next week. Okay, I'll move to that. Can you see my screen, Jonny?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So maybe just to start with, both thanks to our audience today for the questions that were asked and for the participation. I was expecting to see Jonny's whiteboard come up. We'd had good good practice with him multitasking on his iPad and using his nice sketch pen. We didn't get to see that in action today. Maybe next time. But Jonny, also thanks very much for sharing your experience and those insights with us. I think it follows on nicely from what we had on Tuesday. Okay, so I showed this slide on Tuesday, which is just to pre-sell next week's. Actually, sorry, my apologies. It's not next week. So we have a break on Tuesday next week. In fact, the whole of next week, and we move on till the 4th of August. So that's when we'll see you back again. And in that session, Paul Fremantle is going to return and he will wrap up our series. So that'll be the end. It feels like it's going by so quickly, but that'll be the end of it for us. So Paul will close the session next week, on the 4th of August. And the session, like Jonny's been explaining, is going to be cloud focused. We stay with the case study of TimeBank. And Gino is going to take us through what we've done with WSO2 in AWS specifically. And he's got quite a lot of insights to share in that space. So I think that will be a very worthwhile session. And then a WSO2 perspective in terms of cloud will be presented by Chimith. So that'll still keep us with that sort of vision, product and insight, customer insight perspective. And then, like we've done in the previous 2 weeks, we'll then go into a Q&A like today on the 6th of August, on Thursday the 6th of August. I think a question came up. Okay, cool. I don't think that's not a question. It's just a cool. Okay. So that's it for today. Thanks very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again on 9 o'clock South African time, 4th of August. Goodbye.